Today, we become legends.
So recently on the channel we covered the top 10 biggest SMITE nerfs of all time. Go check that video out after this one if you've not seen it yet. So naturally today we're covering the 10 biggest SMITE buffs of all time. As with the previous video, some of these are single buffs and some are a multitude of buffs the same ability got over a period of time. But either way, all 10 of these abilities got a hell of a lot better. Also, reworks won't be included in this video since they often fundamentally change how an ability works, which isn't the same as just an outright buff. So anything like Nike's 1 getting 3 hits always or Raven's release ult won't be on the list despite being huge buffs. If you think I missed something, have a quick check if it will count as a rework or not. But without further ado, let's jump into these insane buffs. So first up we have Raz 2 Divine Light. This wasn't one single buff, but a series of buffs that resulted in a pretty mediocre ability turning into a really good one. Raz 2 at launch was 50% slower to detonate, had 50 base plus 15% scaling less damage, a weaker slow that applied stacks half as fast, and it would not cleanse and immune slows, which it now does. Again, none of these buffs individually are worthy of the list, though the slow cleanse and immunity is pretty close, but it's the summation of all these buffs over time that turned this ability from meh into really good. But that's only number 10, we have some way more insane entries on this list, believe me. So in the same class but a complete contrast to Ra, we have JANUS' ultimate Through Space and Time. If you've been playing Smite since Season 3 or later, you might wonder how on earth JANUS' incredibly powerful ultimate got buffs. Well, back at launch, the Master of Portals was actually the master of getting stunned out of your ult and it's still going on cooldown. Yeah, this ability at launch not only had no CC immunity, making it interruptible by almost any hard CC and taking the cooldown, but he also couldn't move or turn his camera to realign the shot after he started firing. He just locked in his position, kind of like a Ra ult, but with an insanely longer wind-up, slower travel time, and no CC immunity as mentioned. It also only hit gods back then, which is a very minor thing but worth mentioning. How else can I leverage my global ult to farm enemy waves right as they spawn near Phoenix? I mean, to rotate to Gold Fury, of course, that's what I do with JANUS ult. There was also a hilarious nerf that I just have to mention here. JANUS ult no longer dealing damage to enemies in the fountain. The sole reason for this was that at launch, JANUS' ult did way more damage over range than it does now, and with good timing, you could get an ult to hit enemies the very second they spawned in the fountain and insta-kill them from the safety of your own tower. Completely irrelevant to the video, but I just thought that was funny. But moving on, at number 8 we have YMIR's passive, FROSTBITE. This one is a series of simple but extremely effective buffs that turned what was essentially a meme passive that only worked with Deathbringer YMIR back when any god could build any item, into a force to be reckoned with in the support role. At launch, all this passive did was 50% increase basic attack damage to affected targets. Yeah, as I said, the only reason this was even passable beforehand was because of Deathbringer crits stacking with the 50% increase for autos that slap harder than Will Smith.
Somebody once told me the world is gonna roll me.
This bonus was increased to 100% or double damage. The whole affected enemies deal 15% less damage thing was added, that didn't exist before, and the duration was extended from 4 seconds to 6 seconds. 6 seconds of 15% reduced damage is pretty crazy and a far cry from this meme of a passive back in 2012. So we've been on the grind of super old buffs for the start of this video, let's bring it back to this decade for a bit with ERLANG's recent changes, specifically spot weakness. So granted, this did come with a pretty significant damage nerf as well, but this ability gaining 20% lifesteal and 21% damage reduction on the target out of nowhere just has to make this list. As I mentioned in my video on his rework, this ability went from great to insane with these changes, and ERLANG is now one of the best boxing gods in the entire game because of this. Definitely worth a spot on the list, and it's nice to include a few more recent buffs since, like nerfs, they have gotten less extreme over time as Hi-Rez gets better at balancing god releases and keeping the game balanced in general. Apparently that's an unpopular take, but it's just true. But I digress. At number 6 we have the most adorable ultimate ever released, hands down, and that's ARTEMIS' Tusky. The crazy thing about this one is that the ult was never really that bad, it's still a semi-AoE stun regardless of all the buffs it's gotten since 2012. Those buffs include going from no CC immunity at all to 6 seconds of it, yes 6 seconds of complete CC immunity. Lancelot's superhero level horse is hella jealous of Tusky right now. More health and protections were also added in the same patch, along with a 20% movement speed buff for 3 seconds after ulting, though admittedly this was removed the very next patch as they shifted that speed buff to her 2 instead, where it's remained for the rest of her existence. More prots were also added this patch, and then they apparently realised that adding prots isn't going to fix anything, and they just made the BOAR completely immune until it hits its first target. The post-hit delay was reduced from half a second to 1/10 of a second, allowing ARTEMIS much faster follow-up basic attacks or traps once she ults. The whole cone targeter to make Tusky prioritize certain targets was added as well, that didn't always exist. The time it takes for him to select a new target after charging was cut by 2/3 from 1.5 seconds to 0.5 seconds. AI responsiveness was also improved. This sounds small, but Tusky really was stupid back in the day, and it was frustrating to watch him charge the wrong guy, sit there doing nothing, or run in circles trying to find a target, so this was a pretty major buff overall. I have to say the 6 seconds of complete CC immunity that took a while to get nerfed was the most crazy thing here, but just in general, this is so many buffs to one ability, definitely deserving of a spot on the list, I think. Halfway up the list at number 5, we have a very recent one, and that's ESET's 3, Dispel Magic. I know, I'm towing the line between a buff and a rework pretty closely here, but I feel this ability didn't fundamentally change in the way it's used, it just got much better. This one is a bit like Raz 2 in a way, in that it kinda felt like half an ability before and not a full one, possibly related to the fact that her 1, 2 and ults are all insane. But this ability went from giving some magical procs to just ESET, to giving her and nearby allies an absolutely massive HP shield of up to 450. That's competitive with Geb's shield, but it applies to multiple targets. No wonder we've been seeing ESET in support. It also got a major range increase, increased silence duration, and slow potency. The main part here was the shield, but the extra buffs were just a cherry on top to bring this ability in line with the rest of ESET's busted kit. I mean, truly, she doesn't have a bad ability anymore, at least on paper, and these buffs were a huge part in that. Speaking of bad abilities, release Raven, everybody! Okay, so this one is a bit of a cheat since it's actually 2 different abilities, Overhead Kick and Piranha Onslaught. I just couldn't decide which one of these buffs to include in the video and didn't want to use up 2 of the 10 spots on one god, so I lumped them together at number 6. Overhead Kick's buff was very simple, full CC immunity on the 2, it didn't always have this, it was only damage immune on launch, making it very terrible against any ability that had CC and damage. Don't let simple fool you though, this was still an incredible buff and was a huge part of Raven's turnaround from its release, which was arguably the weakest release of all time. Piranha Onslaught was a slightly different story though, with a series of buffs instead of just one impactful one. In just one patch, this ability gained range, base damage, scaling, slow potency, and slow duration. 100 base damage and 25% slower all ranks instead of 10 scaling to 20 was huge for this ability, especially considering it still had a 6-second cooldown at the time and hadn't been nerfed to the 9 seconds it now holds. As I mentioned, Raven was one of the weakest releases of all time, so it makes sense to see him somewhere on the list, but the fact that 2 of his abilities made it and his ult would have been one if it wasn't classed as a rework. This guy got some much needed love after his pitiful launch back in Season 2. Speaking of pitiful launches, at number 3 we have Baba Yaga's ultimate, Home Sweet Home. Another recent launch that I imagine a lot of you played through and got to witness the atrocity that was her ult firsthand. This ultimate was most of the reason Baba Yaga was such a garbage god on release, and the myriad of buffs it's received since Season 7 is just insane. Increased burst damage, base, and scaling. Increased burn damage scaling. Increased projectile speed of the Witchfire bolts. Added 10% power scaling to the shield. Decreased minimum range to allow her to throw Witchfire right at her feet to deal with melee gods. Immunity to backpedal and strafe penalties while in the ult. Increased shield base health, increased shield scaling health, increased knockback strength on the initial drop, can walk through minions while ulting, reduce pre-fire time, and finally remove the self root on cast. Okay, now that I'm done reciting the entire encyclopedia of mankind, we can move on to another ability before I get PTSD of trying to get a single kill with this god at launch. So taking the penultimate spot on the list, we have Thor's Tectonic Rift and Mjolnir's Attunement. Okay, I cheated again, but truly, who wouldn't cheat with this? I mean, come on. Nah, but in all seriousness, these were 2 of the most simple but most game-breaking buffs on the list. Tectonic Rift, Thor's wall, went from being a sluggish wall that slowed enemies and did nothing else, to a lightning-fast wall that stunned for up to 2 seconds and dealt 235 plus 60% scaling and damage. Yep, you heard that right, they added damage to Thor Wall, the Mad Lads. I guess they thought the ult into 1, into 2, into 3 stun lock combo just wasn't enough damage, so they had to add more. It was just insult to injury that they added the stun in this patch as well. Naturally, the damage was removed pretty damn quick, and the stun duration was nerfed pretty heavily as well. But what's the deal with the hammer? Did they also add 500 damage to it for no reason? Good guess, but no. They actually added the ability to teleport to Mjolnir. Yep, at launch, Thor didn't even have this mechanic that is now fundamental to his playstyle. This combined with the wall changes have to be some of the most insane buffs we've ever seen in the decade-long history of Smite.
But there's one they fear. In their tongue, he's
Lil Mana.
Dragonborn.
Yeah!
So one ability among hundreds can rival the sheer number of buffs that Baba's ult got after launch. Vamana's ultimate today is one of the most bloated abilities in the game by strict definition. That doesn't mean it's the most powerful, but it does mean that it has more different effects on it than Ajax has Amaterasu hoodies. However, at launch, many of these effects were not present and had to be buffed in, hence his number 1 placement on this list. Immunity to the basic attack movement penalty, aka haste in modern terms. Immune to slows that then became immunity to all CCs. Yeah, at launch Vamana was not CC immune during this ult, much like many others from back in the day such as Ra and JANUS. I didn't play back then, but it's hard to imagine this ult functioning very well without CC immunity. One stun and you can create enough distance between him and you that you can just wait out the rest of the ultimate. The HP regen was increased from 2% to 5% per tick, the physical power was buffed from 110 to 140 at the top end, AoE radius of his basic attacks during the ult increased from 12 to 16, increased protections in the ult by 10 at all ranks, added a stacking health shield alongside the regeneration, added the ability to pass through player-made walls while ulting, essentially deleting one of the main counters to this in Odin ult, removed minion collision much like Barber's ult to stop him getting body blocked by those pesky rats, stacking movement speed buff of up to 15% for hitting basics during the ult, and finally decreased movement penalties for attacking, backpedaling and strafing. That's 10 solid and impactful buffs, some of them being insanely good like CC immunity, haste, the health shield, etc. This ability alongside maybe Baba's ult has to be one of the most buffed abilities of all time, both in terms of sheer number and the impact of those buffs. That's why he's number 1, while Baba and Thor were number 3 and 2. Baba had lots of buffs, but on average they were weaker than Vamana's, and Thor's buffs were some of the largest single buffs of all time, but there weren't that many of them. Vamana has both of these covered and then some, definitely deserving of the number 1 spot on the list. But what do you think is the most crazy buff of all time? Let me know why it's Mercury getting 381 movement speed instead of 380 to make him the actual fastest god alive down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out you nerds.